Previously, Tornak cheerfully introduced the group to Alonzo the Praetor and told him he was fairly certain said Praetor had been following them since the very beginning. Needless to say, that statement led to a number of raised eyebrows, incredulous looks, and sarcastic remarks. Alonzo revealed that he'd been the one who let them escape during their initial combat with the cultists and Praetors back in Avanos. He'd interrogated the cultists of Thalacros who had been captured before their mysterious death, and something about the group had made him curious. He'd been following them from a distance ever since. He talked a little about the Shadow Spawn and the pretty lie that the world had suddenly become safe when magic was abolished, before admitting that a lie was all it was. Various groups worked in the shadows to keep them at bay. After some back and forth, it became clear that Alonzo was loyal to the idea of the Praetors, but not its reality. He knew there was corruption within the Order, just as there was within the Temple. He also knew that someone high up was clearly pulling the strings, but he wasn't certain who it was, so he was hoping the group could give him some more information. Keelan was open to sharing information, although he glanced at Sean for permission to tell some of the story that was more directly related to her family. While Sean wasn't willing to mention Luminous herself, she was fine with one of the others in the group bringing it up. That way she'd have plausible deniability. As she had already learned several times, loopholes were important when it came to dealing with them. The group slowly shared some information, although they didn't bring up everything. Alonzo mentioned that everyone in the local breaker bar had been killed the night before. Since it was the Luminous who sent the group to the temple in the first place, it was certainly possible they'd arranged to have any competition removed from the playing board. Alonzo became worried that they were being played and that someone out there was sending a message to both the group and himself. Since no one was actively trying to kill them, though, they decided to go with it for the time being. The group agreed to send Alonzo information as long as he provided Keelan of details about the Praetors who had slaughtered his village a decade or so ago. He also gave them a device that would let them track other Praetors nearby, but if they used it, Praetors could also track them, although they'd most likely assume the group were Praetors themselves, as long as they didn't see them. It was around then that the group brought up the fact that Taria was wearing clearly cursed armor and was definitely being affected by it. Alonzo took a look and told them that the armor was turning Taria's bones into mithril. He couldn't help just then, although he thought he might be able to do something the next day, if, and that was a big if, Taria was still alive. Sean told him to close his eyes and pretend he didn't see any illegal magecraft, at which point she used magic to remove the curse. Taria reluctantly agreed that maybe there had been a curse after all, although she pointedly didn't look towards Keelan when admitting it. Alonzo didn't want to head back through the gate with the group, as it would be very obvious they'd talked if anyone was watching. Instead, he jumped off the cliff at the back of the room and flew away with mechanical wings. Everyone agreed that he was very cool. The group made their way out of the catacombs, with Keelan grabbing some gems on the way out. The vision Sean had during the aftermath of the earlier fight had revealed to her that a diamond could be useful, magically speaking, so despite her misgivings about stealing from the dead, she accepted the gem. They stopped to speak to the Illuminator on the way out, and she was very thankful for their help. She was apologetic about the fact that Alonzo had showed up, as she couldn't stop him. She also stopped panicking once the group convinced her that no, they hadn't murdered a Praetor and he just left another way. On the way out, Oz carried the obviously cursed breastplate and glaive he'd taken from one of the undead as if it belonged to him, and the Illuminator didn't notice. He didn't bring it up to her, though, as he'd implied that he would. Once they were out of the temple, several of the group headed back to the Wyvern's Claw to check on Yara and Enola, while the others went to run various errands. Keelan and Taria went to pick up alchemical supplies. Zaya and Oz made a beeline to the armor in the city. Oz wanted to buy new weapons, considering his had been all but destroyed in the first fight, but he also wanted to try to sell the probably cursed armor that he'd stolen from the crypt. The problem was that the person he'd stolen it from was a very well-known weapon maker, so there were immediately lots of questions about how he'd gotten it. Also, the dwarf's grandson worked at the shop and knew that all of Oz's excuses were blatant lies, which didn't exactly help either. The dwarf offered a finder's fee for finding his grandfather's glaive and armor, and he advised Oz that if he took the offer, then he wouldn't get the guards involved. Oz decided not to push his luck. Who said that crime didn't pay? Later in the evening, the group headed to the Wayward Cartographers Society to turn in the rubbing that Keelan had managed to get of the unknown waystone they'd found. The drow woman he'd met earlier in the day was very shocked to hear that they'd found one in the city that no one knew about, and there was a very significant finder's fee. The group then headed back to the Wyvern's Claw and prepared to head out the next morning to look for the missing caravan. There was some back and forth about whether to take Yara and Enola with them or leave them behind, but they ultimately decided it would probably be safer to leave them at the inn. Little did they know that Enola would have all sorts of ideas about just what heroic deeds they'd accomplished while away from them. Based on the maps they'd looked at, the group knew that it would probably take about 4 days to get to the mine where the caravan had last been known to be. Things went fairly well at first, only for Oz to try to make fondue for dinner at camp that night. Shockingly, fire melts snow, and if your camp is on top of packed snow and not a ledge, like you thought, that can be a bad thing. Tornak and Zaya may have fallen off a cliff, but it was fine. Nobody died. The next day went smoothly, with Sean noticing a pack of wolves when they started stalking the group. She quickly helped them hide their tracks and scent so that the pack lost them. On the third night, Tornak decided to play music for the group, which unfortunately drew the attention of the wolf pack from the day before that the group had managed to slip away from. The wolves attacked the camp, and the group had to fight back. Later that night, Sean slipped into her tent by herself to try something. During the vision she'd had of the crystal, she'd seen a glimpse of something that made her think that she might possibly have the ability to reach out to people far away. She wasn't sure how it worked, but she thought it would be worth a try. And she was able to use sending to talk to her sister back in Avanos. The next morning, the weather was unusually warm, which initially made travel much easier for them. At least until an avalanche occurred. While most of the group were able to keep themselves from going under the snow, both Keelan and Tornak were caught in it. There were definitely a few seconds of panic before Sean cast Detect Object to search for the clothes that each of them was wearing, which let the group know where to start digging. It was close, but they managed to get both of them back to the surface before they suffocated. The group quickly surveyed the area, made sure there were no other chances of an avalanche, and took a short rest to give Keelan and Tornak time to recover. Once everyone felt up to it, they kept pushing forward. Eventually, the group finally arrived at the mine where the caravan had last been seen. There wasn't any sign of movement, but there was a broken cart and 2 bodies in the snow. They found lots of suspicious signs, including one of magical fire being used in an attack, and Keelan located some larger-than-average footprints. The group knew that there were supposed to be 5 people in the caravan, not just 2, plus they were supposed to find the cargo as well. They noticed some smoke in the distance in the same direction that the tracks were headed, so they decided to head that way. Sean used some magic to make everyone a little bit stealthier than usual, and Tornak got an even bigger boost since quiet wasn't typically in his vocabulary. It helped enough that the group was able to reach the edge of Calamity Canyon without being spotted. When they made it to where the smoke was, they saw 4 orcs and 3 humans. 1 orc was being carried on a palanquin by the humans, and there was also an orc with a bow, an orc with a sword, and an older orcish woman with a staff. They were all standing around a fire, trying to keep warm. The humans put down the orc they were carrying, and he demanded that one of them tell a joke. A young man in his early 20s tried telling several, but the orc didn't appreciate any of them. He turned towards the others and commented that they should just eat the human for dinner, at which point Taria turned large, and both she and Tornak started to rush towards the enemies, belatedly followed by the others. And that is where we left off.